The Communist Manifesto is one of the best known books in modern history. Having said that, most people who've heard of it haven't read it, and many who have read it will have questions about its contents. The German sociologist Max Weber, for instance, dismissed it, saying, "The so-called materialistic conception of history, with the crude elements of genius of the early form, which appeared, for instance, in the Communist Manifesto, still prevails only in the minds of laymen and dilettantes." Well, I'm assuming that if you're listening to the Sound of Solidarity, you're not a dilettante, but you still may have questions. So in this episode, we're going to look at the arguments put forward by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in this pamphlet published 174 years ago in 1848. And to introduce us to the Communist Manifesto, I'm talking to Solidarity member Feiyi Zhang. You're listening to the Sound of Solidarity, brought to you by Solidarity, and we're a revolutionary socialist group in Australia. If you'd like to find out more about us, our website is solidarity.net.au. I'm David Glanz and I'm recording this episode on unceded Wurundjeri land in Naarm, or Melbourne. So welcome, Faye.
David, thanks for having me.
So let's start at the beginning, perhaps with explaining who Marx and Engels were and how they came to write the manifesto in 1848. So what's the context?
Yeah, I think, for any person at the moment interested in radical ideas or social change, there is a pull towards understanding Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. I think particularly at the moment, as the world just feels like it's going to, one crisis to the next and getting worse. And I think that was really what was happening when Marx and Engels came to write the manifesto in 1848. So they didn't just get their ideas out of nowhere, but really they were writing their ideas in a period of immense crisis where Europe at that time was aflame with crisis and rebellion and revolution. And in 1848, there was actually an uprising that broke out in Paris, and the feeling that revolution was spreading rapidly across the continent. And this was, a period of great change in the world where really you were seeing the emergence of industrial capitalism, the system that we live in for the first time. And so the revolutions weren't against the existing bosses, but were new bosses trying to get rid of the rotten old regimes in Europe run by kings and dictators. And so all kinds of radical discussions and political groups starting to emerge and, insert into this Marx and Engels and their, really, I think, transformative ideas that we now know as Marxism.
Who were Marx and Engels, I suppose? I mean, were they just authors or were they activists themselves?
Yeah, well, that's really the context behind the Communist Manifesto is they're trying to put together a new manifesto for the Communist League. So it's a new revolutionary organisation, which Marx and Engels had actually formed through arguments with organisations and people involved in the Paris uprising. So they're very much themselves activists, revolutionaries, trying to put together a platform for how to transform society and change society in this brutal context of industrial capitalism. So they're very much activists themselves and not just theorists.
So in some ways that makes the manifesto even more remarkable, that it was written as an intervention in a particular period and a particular struggle, and yet we're still reading it with interest and fascination all these years later. If there's one message in the pamphlet that many people have heard of, it's that the working class can change the world, and Marx and Engels famously sign off with "working men of all countries unite." Of course, they were creatures of their time, so they used gendered language. Yet the working class in 1848 was tiny and existed only in parts really of Northern Europe and pockets of the Northeast United States. So what did Marx and Engels see in this new class that others didn't?
Yeah, so I think it's really important how, you framed the context of Marx and Engels as, they're revolutionaries, activists, interested in actually changing society, getting rid of, all the oppression and poverty that they see in the factories within London or Manchester. So I think for them, they're seeing this possibility actually within a new oppressed class, within the working class, working within these new factories, to actually change society that did not exist before. And they're able to understand this because they are historians. They've looked at changing human societies, and they really understand the limitations of previous societies, or really for them still current societies of feudalism, of slavery, which were class societies where the majority of people were oppressed and exploited. But there was no way that they could actually take over that society or change that society themselves, because they were limited by the society and the limits of what that society could create. So on one level, a limitation was that, for example, under feudalism, Marx famously says that the limitations of the society were the linings of the feudal lord, that there was never enough surplus developed to actually sustainably create a new society. There was never the technology that was developed to fully, deliver for the needs of everyone in that society. Or you could look at the limits of the slave system, where it was a direct, brutal oppression that was met by a totalitarian system where people were not drawn together in the way that they were under the new industrial system of capitalism, where people were drawn together, in a so-called free way, but really they were disciplined to produce profit for these new industrial capitalists and bosses in London, a new kind of ruling class. So they were beginning to see, I think, through their activity and their activism, but also their analysis of history and human society, that actually, for the first time, we're starting to see a society where there is enough wealth, where the oppressed class do have a lot of power being drawn into factories to produce profit, and maybe these people can actually take over society and run them in a different way in the interest of everyone.
Obviously, other writers, radical writers of the time, knew there was a working class, but it was that ability of the workers to organise and fight back that Marx and Engels saw, and that was different. There was a revolt a few years before they wrote the manifesto by weavers in the German region of Silesia, and I think that had a big impact on them. They saw that they weren't just impoverished victims of a system, but they were capable of organising and fighting back. Is that what you see as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think, they were very much influenced by the Chartist movements that are emerging around political rights. They did see the uprisings happening across Europe, and that there was that possibility to actually transform society by striking, by stopping, the profits running in the system. That there was an immense power there within the ability of workers to get that kind of profit. To make that surplus, they could actually stop the system together as well.
And the other thing about Working Men of All Countries Unite is that it actually has a global vision, which is one of the most remarkable things, that Marx and Engels picked up on a phenomenon that was in a tiny proportion of the world, and they said, this is the future for humanity.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's, one of the amazing things about when you read the Communist Manifesto as well, is that there's so much that's, relevant to today, that you can, you can see today how interlinked the international system of capitalism is, and how much social transformation needs to happen on a global level, and that they were able to try and, weld this together at the time. But I think that's also from, the kind of uprisings and rebellions that were happening across Europe influencing them as well.
Now, my copy of the manifesto has an introduction by the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky. And Trotsky argues, and this is a quote, obviously, the materialist conception of history, discovered by Marx only a short while before and applied with consummate skill in the manifesto, has completely withstood the test of events and the blows of hostile criticism. So can you explain to us what is meant by the materialist conception?
Yeah, so Marx obviously was not the first person to see the world, in a materialist way, that, the actual structures of society, the economic system, really influences the way that the world is. But I think what's really, transformative about Marx's perspective is that he sees changes in economic systems in such a clear way that is very dynamic. So he brought dynamism to understanding materialism, which is often called historical materialism. And yeah, I think it's really, there was no one that was able to understand it in a way that was dynamic, that understood that changes in the material world, so changes mainly in the way that we get, in the most important way, get our means of livelihood. So, under feudal lords, that was extracting surplus from peasants. Under capitalism, that's workers working for wage to make profits for bosses. That this structures the whole of the society we live in, but actually there can be tensions within that structure and within changes in the way that we get our livelihoods that can propel change. But this isn't just a linear process. It often happens through revolutions. And so this is what happened. Well, this is what was happening at the time that Marx and Engels were writing the Communist Manifesto, that there were revolutions happening by actually the new capitalist classes against the existing feudal systems and trying to create a new system. So, that understanding of revolutionary change, of dynamism in the economic structure that influences the political structures, proves to be very important for understanding why actually there can be a different system from capitalism, that workers could play that kind of role in revolutionising the society that we live in.
The manifesto is very complimentary about capitalism, and Marx and Engels spend several pages praising its dynamism. I remember the very first time I read the manifesto, that really struck me. It's not what I was expecting to read. But at the same time as they're complimentary about the dynamism of capitalism, they argue it has to be overthrown. So can you take us through that argument?
Yeah, I think it's not to be understated the kind of, world that people did live in prior to capitalism, where you actually, you depended on the seasons as to whether you could be fed in your community, in your feudal family. That there was no way that actually a lot of, for example, feudal uprisings could be successful, because there wasn't, already existing ways that people could join together and take advantage of, the benefits and the surpluses, because there was no ongoing way to guarantee its viability. But for the first time, actually, capitalism develops this immensely dynamic, profitable system that can deliver overwhelmingly for the majority of people in society. And, that we're talking about, transitions that we know are possible to renewable energy, to, feed everyone. But much more than that, the technology that exists to make sure that we have, amazing healthcare and schooling and, probably much more than we could ever conceive of, working day to day within the limits of our society. But for the first time that this is possible, that's not to be understated. But the limits is really, the capitalist system itself. And this is something that, Marx writes about, particularly through his economic writings, that, the system has become a fetter on itself because it's only interested in accumulating more and more profit. So even though there's so much that can be done within our society now because of how much it's progressed, actually the obsession with profit and competition means that isn't being put into, actually delivering for the needs of people and society in general.
Marx and Engels also argue that the class struggle, in fact this is how they open the pamphlet, that class struggle is the driving force of recorded human history. And in the pamphlet they argue that in modern times, in the capitalist era, the working class alone is a revolutionary class. So why did they say that? And does that argument still apply today? People often doubt that even class structures still exist in the way that Marx and Engels experienced them.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's, for people interested in social change, there's firstly appreciating the importance of that analytical argument from Marx and Engels that they have this really clear and dynamic way of understanding how that class struggle has determined how societies change. So, in the transition between slavery to feudalism, from feudalism to capitalism, there was a struggle over who was going to benefit and what kind of mode of production was going to be the one that won over to structure the entire society. And that's a really important, way of being able to understand changes in human history. And that is really critical for, their understanding of why the working class is a revolutionary class, because it doesn't come out of nowhere. It doesn't just say the society, they're not just saying capitalism is bad, therefore we need to overthrow it. Actually, it comes from this analytical understanding of human history and class struggle that's informed how previous class systems have changed. And the dominant class antagonism now is between the working class and the ruling class. So who is going to win out from that struggle? And if we know that inherent within class societies is a tension, that there has to be some kind of resolution to this process, then we understand that the working class can be a revolutionary class, because it has that ability to, as we are the people that work in within the economic mode of production to produce profit, actually use that in our power to overturn society by striking, by walking out and creating a new society. And that has been, I think, proven as possible, many times since Marx and Engels have written the Communist Manifesto. And, they were really, I think, the starting point for us to understand this over a century of revolutionary movements that have happened in the working class, although none of them have been entirely successful.
But the working class has changed, or on the surface it's changed, since 1848, since Marx and Engels wrote about its revolutionary potential. So in Australia today, manufacturing is a fairly small section of the economy, and in terms of employment, it seems to be shrinking consistently. Many people are white-collar employees. They work in schools and hospitals and shops and offices. So is the working class today still the same kind of force that Marx and Engels identified?
Yeah, definitely. I think if anything today, the working class is at least over half the world's population, and much more, dominant part of the population at the time of Marx and Engels, when it was just a burgeoning social force. And I think it's important to distinguish between the class structure and class struggle, because class struggle is often when the importance of class becomes clear to people. When you see people on strike, when you see people fighting, walking out of their workplaces and fighting, and you see high levels of, union strikes across the world, that can make it obvious that class struggle exists. But actually, it doesn't. Even if when that's not happening, so when you have low levels of strikes, like there has been for a long time in Australia, until very recently, the recent spike in teachers and nurses striking, but it doesn't change the structure that exists, where fundamentally it's a relationship where workers have to sell their ability to work to get their means of subsistence. So, people had to do this as peasants or as slaves. They had to sell themselves in some way to survive. But under capitalism, it's a so-called free system, but we sell ourselves for a wage, and we make that profit for capitalists, or we assist in teaching the next generation of workers so that the capitalist system can continue. But we still have to, day in, day out, sell ourselves for a wage to be able to survive in the system. So I think very much that class structure is there. Whether it will be realised and whether people will fight around that, that's up to us.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, every generation has to learn and relearn the lessons. And looking around the world, it's so inspiring to see the first Amazon warehouse unionized in the United States, to see Starbucks being unionized over and over again. And there's obviously every possibility that exactly the same process can and should happen here. Now, critics often say that Marxists today want to establish a minority dictatorial regime, and obviously they're often guided in that thought by the experience of the Stalinist dictatorships. Yet the manifesto is clear that the working class movement that Marx and Engels look to can only be, quote, the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interests of the immense majority. So why were Marx and Engels so confident in arguing this, and why was democracy actually so central to their vision?
Yeah, I think, it's important to say, like, now in 2022, we've seen so many working class movements that have been co-opted or misguided, or revolutions pushed into supporting, various governments that were just interested in maintaining their own power rather than looking, to deliver for working class people. And this is all entirely possible today, but I don't think this takes away from, what Marx was writing about, which I think for the first time, it was a really clear manifesto around why there needed to be a movement that was for the working class itself. So not someone representing you in Parliament, but looking at, representing this working class that was going on strike, that was fighting, to the fundamentally transformed society, that was fighting within factories to have, some kind of sense of democracy and profit back from the bosses. Yeah, and so I don't think it changes the fundamental importance of what Marx and Engels have discovered. And this kind of movement, I think, is something that we have not yet seen in a really developed form, except for during the Russian Revolution and Revolutionary Wave in the 1917, that we're able to actually build a movement that could, through a Soviet system, represent democracy from below, where they had, at least in the first couple of years of the revolution, accountable councils where each workplace could have a delegate, or a number of people, numbers of workers could have a delegate from their workplace that could represent their interests in a truly democratic way. So when you think about what you've said about the Amazon warehouses, or modern union movements, actually that potential is still there. And by representing working class interests, rather than the interests of people in Parliament, or some kind of strategy within Parliament, that's the only way that you can, I think, represent that transformation that we want to see.
And in some ways, the Russian Revolution is confirmation of what the manifesto argues, because when Marx and Engels were talking about the working class movement leading the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority, they were recognising that there were other classes in society, but workers, when they rose, could overturn everything and lead other oppressed groupings. So in Russia, we saw that though the working class was a minority, they effectively gave the political and an economic lead to the peasantry, who were much larger in number, but weren't capable of challenging capitalism in the way that the workers did. So workers don't necessarily have to be an absolute majority in a given country to be able to lead that struggle.
Yes, definitely.
One thing that often confuses readers is where the manifesto says the communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. And yet we look around in Australia and elsewhere, and Marxists are clearly trying to establish parties, often in fierce competition with others. So in trying to build an organisation, build solidarity, have we got something wrong?
I think what Marx is talking about here is not against politics or political parties. If you could say anything about Marx, you'd say that he's one of the most political people that that has existed, that his whole life was dedicated to building actually political currents and parties and building a political revolution. But I think what he's trying to say here is that that so many communists think that or political activists think they can create a party, but it doesn't actually represent the interests of the working class as a whole. Or, for example, at the time of the Communist Manifesto, there were many different groupings that were emerging around that were based more on uprisings, smaller groups of people that led to, they were quite involved later on in the Paris Commune. But there needed to actually be, at that time, an organisation that reflected a kind of democracy within the working class movement, and reflected that involvement of people within the working class, rather than little sects or different groupings that more represented a middle class within society. So I think what he's talking about here is actually building an open, democratic working class party that's needed to, involve working class people to politically transform society. And Marx definitely himself is someone who is involved throughout his life in trying to build political parties to, a political working class party. So I think that kind of, the need for that exists, as much today as then, if you looked at the outcome of the Paris Commune, and that inability to really look at the power of the working class itself and be able to draw on that. Actually, that is the only way to create an alternative source of power and democracy, but actually, democratizing and looking at where the majority of people are in society and looking at that power there. Otherwise, you can end up in, little sects or within, trying to take over parliament, without looking at the power of the working class more generally itself.
There is so much crammed into this quite short publication. I really urge listeners to read it for themselves, and I'm including a link to an online version in the podcast post, so please dive in. One last question, Fei. Marx and Engels allowed themselves a big flourish. They were writing a manifesto. They were calling people to arms. And they really went hard when they wrote, quote, "What the bourgeoisie produces above all is its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Unfortunately, capitalism is still with us. So were Marx and Engels wrong on the prospects for changing the world?"
I feel like if Marx and Engels could go back in time, they might rewrite that now, because they've been under such immense criticism for this, and how it's been used by people with no interest in Marxism, like Stalinists or Maoists, to look at really dictatorial ways that interpretations or ways that they've misused Marxism, because what they were writing in the context in which they thought they were on the brink of revolution, which there was mass revolution only like 30, 40 years later across Europe. But I think what we can take from that is their absolute commitment to building revolutionary organizations, to building, revolutionary movements against oppression and for, genuine equality and, to get rid of exploitation under capitalism. They were arguing for that at the time. They wanted to create a revolution, and that was possible. And you can see now that capitalism is still creating its own grave diggers in terms of, look at the Amazon warehouse workers, or you look at what's happening in China, you look at, all the contradictions of climate change and increasing militarism in the region. There's never been, there had never been a better time for people to become political and to be in tune with all of the massive crises that are happening in the world, and to get involved in working class movements to act on that and to actually change that. I think for us, in Solidarity, we not only look at Marx and Engels analytically and understand, look to understand their writing and politics, but also look to act on what they, did throughout their lives, which is try and create political movements and an organisation that can really understand society but also lead movements, lead working class struggles into political organisations that have the power to challenge the enormous power of capitalism itself. So I think there is still so much that's valuable about Marxism today, and that's what we're using and putting into our movements and into solidarity.
That's a great note to finish on. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, David.